We turn to Psalm 18. Psalm 18 is a long psalm if it comes to the number of verses. It has 50 verses, and actually there are only 3 psalms that are longer with regards to number of verses. That's Psalm 78, which has 72 verses, Psalm 89, which has 52 verses, and of course Psalm 119, which has 176 verses. As the psalm is long, so also is its title. Actually, there's only one psalm with a longer title, that's Psalm 60. The title of Psalm 18 is To the Chief Musician, a psalm of David, the servant of the Lord, who spoke to the Lord the words of this song on the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. And he said, that's the title. It tells us a lot. It tells us what the psalm is about, and first of all, to whom it is addressed, to the chief musician or the choir master. But it also says that David speaks to the Lord. So that could imply that these are one and the same, the chief musician and God, with some belief. But it can also mean that the choir master is informed that these verses are spoken to the Lord. It also tells us how David viewed himself, namely not as a king, but as a servant of the Lord. It's a humble and correct position. It's interesting to note also that David mentions the delivery from his enemies and from the hand of Saul, which means that he does not count Saul among his enemies. It also shows the heart of David. He remained respectful to Saul because he knew Saul was the anointed king, anointed by God. He was also his father-in-law, by the way. And in spite of the fact that Saul had been after his life, David maintained this position. Now, the contents of this psalm are recorded twice in the Bible. Once here, Psalm 18, and once in 2 Samuel chapter 22, which is almost literally the same. And from the context there in 2 Samuel 22, we know that he spoke these words, David spoke these words towards the end of his life. Whereas Psalm 18 was written before he became king, before he ascended to the throne, I could say. So he was still a relatively young man. So that's when he wrote it, and then he sort of reflected back on the same words toward the end of his life, singing it or reciting it with gratitude. And this psalm truly is a song of praise. In the introduction of this series of videos about the psalms, I spoke about that the psalms are called Tehillim, songs of praise, and this certainly is a Tehillah, a song of praise. It honors and praises God in every way. And it's basically broken down in 3 parts. One is God's deliverance for David. Then in the center there is principle of deliverance. And then the second or the third part speaks about God's blessings for David. Then there are some other meanings or parallel structures we can find, but we'll speak about that next time. This psalm is too long to cover in one video. From the perspective of the time in which it was written, it leans on the past and it looks to the future, and all that to praise God. And of course, when David repeats this psalm in 2 Samuel 22, all that he had initially written for the future is then present and past. So he can look back on this and see how indeed God's blessings and God's promises were materialized in his life. So then he begins with describing God's deliverance for him. And he does so first by telling us who God is. He praises God in the first 3 verses to begin with. He says, I will love thee, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my strength, in whom I trust, in whom I will trust, my buckler and the horn of my salvation and my high tower. I will call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised. So shall I be saved from mine enemies. The psalm begins with a powerful and triumphant declaration. I will love thee. I will love thee. David decided to love the Lord. Even more, he felt compelled to love the Lord. And he uses here an unusual word for love, one that expresses great compassion, deep and tender love. And David did not love the Lord because he made him king. Because at this time, when he wrote this, he hadn't yet taken the throne. David loved God because he had delivered him. And that may seem a logical result. God helped me, and so I love God. But most of us would have given up on God already in that situation. Because since the day that David had been anointed to become king, until that moment that he wrote this psalm, about 20 years had passed. And 20 years he had lived as a fugitive. He had lost everything. He had lost his safety. He had lost his youth. He had lost his family. He has lost all his comfort. And he could have lost hope to ever ascend the throne. But still he loved God. He wasn't king yet, but he loved God. God had not spared him from trouble and hardships. He had to hide in caves, sleep with stones as his pillow. But he recognized that God had delivered him through it all, and he loved God for it. I will love thee, he says. It's a deliberate decision. It's a deliberate decision even more than it is an emotional one. And that may explain why this phrase is missing in the version that we read in 2 Samuel 22. As I said, it's almost literally the same. And there are a few small differences, and this is one of them. This phrase, I will love thee, O Lord, that's missing in 2 Samuel 22. Why? Because he reflects on this psalm at the end of his life. He doesn't need to say, I will love thee. He was loving God, and he had loved God, and he would continue to do so. David then tells us what God is to him. His rock, his fortress, his deliverer. He's praising God. He does not say this because he had learned this at Sunday school. No, he had actually known this by faith from the very beginning. And we can see that when he runs towards Goliath with only a sling stone. He had faith already then. But now, so many years later, so many hardships later, he had also learned it by experience. My strength in whom I will trust, he says. One can trust in his own strength, in the strength of one's armies or weapons. But they will all fail sometimes. Nothing gives more peace and absolute guarantee than trusting in the strength of the Lord, which never fails nor falters. Paul writes about that in Ephesians 6 verse 10. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. That is where we get our strength, from the Lord and from the Lord alone. And David continues, and he lists no less than 9 titles for God. He begins in verse 1 by saying his strength. He uses a word here that is hiski in Hebrew, which is indeed strength, power, or help. And I get back to that in a minute. So that's the first title he gives. Then he says his rock. This is a place of shelter, of safety, solid ground. And we know, of course, that it points to Jesus, the rock, from whom living water flows. And Paul makes this beautiful connection between the rock and Jesus. When he speaks about the Israelites in the wilderness under Moses, he says about that in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 4, and did all drink the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. He's making the connection, and he's also making a nice link between the physical water that they drank from the physical rock that Moses smote with his staff, between that rock and the spiritual rock that followed them, he says, and that rock was Christ. David also calls God his fortress. It's a place of protection and safety, and how much he had needed that while he was being in caves and shelters. But even later in his life, as he recites this in 2 Samuel 22, God, the fortress, had proven better protection than his own palace. When he trusted in the strength of his army, which he did, he made this error, and he trusted in the safety of his palace, that's when he had fallen into great sin. Of course, referring to the episode with Uriah and Bathsheba. He had learned that God is his fortress and only God. He calls God his deliverer, the one who made a way of escape. God made a way when there seemed to be no way. He calls him his God. And that seems a bit open door to call God your God, but it's good that we remind ourselves that God is actually God. That's not to be taken light. There's only one God, and God is almighty above everything. But more than believing, knowing or calling him God, we should, like David, call him my God. That is what he says, my God. Not anyone else's God. Of course, God is everyone else's God, but it's not like the strange God of the other peoples. They were not his God, but this was his God. And God was always there for him. He calls God his strength. And that's why I emphasize this in verse 1. He also says my strength. And then in verse 2 again my strength. It's the same word, at least here in this translation, King James translation that I'm using here. But it's not the same original word. Here the word is tzur in Hebrew, which means rock. So in verse 1 it is strength in the sense of power and help that God provides. In verse 2 it is strength in the sense of a cliff, a refuge. And you see that in 2 Samuel 22, in verse 2, strength is translated by rock. Whereas here in Psalm 18 it's both the word strength. So there's a little inconsistency there because the source text is the same. Just saying that these are different words with a different meaning. Then he continues to call God his shield. And the shield defends against the deadly arrows and blows of the enemy. And he calls him the horn of his salvation. It's a phrase we find several times in the Old Testament. And of course we looked at the meaning of that when we were studying the Tabernacle, the altar of burnt offering in particular. And we find this phrase also in Psalm 118, verse 27, which is of course a messianic psalm. It is about Jesus. It says there, God is the Lord, which hath shewed us light. Bind the sacrifice with cords, even unto the horns of the altar. So the horns, four horns on the corners of the altar, were used to bind the sacrificial animal with cords, it says, with ropes. And these horns were then also sprinkled with blood by the priest. We find that in Exodus 29, verse 12. And thou shalt take of the blood of the bullock and put it upon the horns of the altar with thy finger. So this points in every way to Yeshua and his blood that brought salvation. And the four horns sprinkled with blood, they point also to the four wounds that Jesus had in his hands and feet. So the horn of my salvation points directly to Jesus. And finally, the ninth title David gives to God is his high tower. It's a place of refuge and safety. A place from where you can see the enemy from a great distance. It's a stronghold where you find protection. Now David believed that all these were attributes of God. He didn't just believe it, he knew it was so. He had experienced it. And he was experiencing it. His God, upon whom he called and who he, with the same voice, praised. It is the God who saved him from all his enemies. This is what it says in the title of this psalm. The Lord that delivered him from the hand of all his enemies. Not most, not some, but all. And, in addition, from the hand of Saul. It hadn't always been easy. There had been tests and trials. But God was faithful, worthy to be praised. Then David continues in verse 4. The sorrows of death compassed me, and the floods of ungodly men made me afraid. The sorrows of hell compassed me about. The snares of death prevented me. In my distress I called upon the Lord, and cried unto my God. He heard my voice out of his temple. And my cry became before him, even into his ears. Now David names here two threats that made him afraid. There is death and ungodliness. An interesting combination. Death, he wasn't referring to physical death, but to eternal death. He speaks about the sorrows of Sheol, of hell. It was spiritual and eternal death more than physical death. And he speaks about this, the danger of this overwhelming ungodliness that was around him. And seeing this as a danger to fear shows that David had a sensitive heart. He saw evil and he saw the danger of it for what it was. And this is something we should also learn. It's a good lesson for us. And these dangers made David cry out to the Lord, his strength, his stronghold, and his deliverer. Yes, God wants to hear our voice, even though he knows our needs. I said it also the other time in Psalm 17. We read a similar thing that David was crying out. But we also read it in Psalm 3, verse 4. It's almost the same verses here. I cried unto the Lord, and he heard me out of his holy place. Out of his holy temple, he writes here. This is also interesting because we have to remind ourselves that when he wrote this, there was no physical temple built yet. Actually, Jerusalem wasn't even under Israeli control at that time. But as God had even shown to Moses on the mountain, God had a temple, a heavenly temple. And we read about it in Hebrews 12, as well as in Revelation chapter 15. And that heavenly temple served as a model for the tabernacle. He continues then, verse 7, and I read through until verse 15. Then the earth shook and trembled. The foundations also of the hills moved and were shaken, because he was wroth. There went up a smoke out of his nostrils, and fire out of his mouth devoured. Coals were kindled by it. He bowed the heavens also, and came down, and darkness was under his feet. And he rode upon a cherub, and did fly. Yeah, he did fly upon the wings of the wind. He made darkness his secret place. His pavilion round about him were dark waters and thick clouds of the skies. At the brightness that was before him, his thick clouds passed, hailstones and coals of fire. The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the highest gave his voice, hailstones and coals of fire. Yeah, he sent out his arrows and scattered them, and he shot out lightnings and discomfited them. Then the channels of waters were seen, and the foundations of the world were discovered at thy rebuke, O Lord, at the blast of the breath of thy nostrils. It's powerful, it's also poetic language. God indeed had heard David's cry out of his holy temple. And the time had come for God to deliver David. And that meant judgment against David's enemies. And David describes these events in a most dramatic way. And it reminds us of the events described in the book of Revelation during the trumpet judgments in particular. And as this here in Psalm 18 begins with David's prayers, David's cry unto the Lord, and then this judgment coming and deliverance with it from heaven, we see the same pattern in the book of Revelation. It's the prayers of the saints and then follow these judgments. And we see the same things, the thunderings, the lightnings, the earthquakes. And I want to read this portion from Revelation 8, verses 3 through 6. And another angel came and stood at the altar, having a golden censer, and there was given unto him much incense, that he should offer it with the prayers of all saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne. And the smoke of the incense, which came with the prayers of the saints, ascended up before God out of the angel's hand. And the angel took the censer, and filled it with fire of the altar, and cast it into the earth. And there were voices, and thunderings, and lightnings, and an earthquake. And the 7 angels, which had the 7 trumpets, prepared themselves to sound. And so, of course, after that follow these trumpet judgments, where we see more of these shaking of the elements. And that's really what it's about, and that's also what David describes, how God uses the elements to literally shake them, with earthquakes, dark clouds, hailstones, dark waters of the skies, thunders, coals of fire. God is angry. Smoke out of his nostrils and fire out of his mouth, David says in a poetic way. And God's judgment, once it comes quickly. David says he rode upon a cherub and flew. It indicates the speed with which this comes. And thus equally speedily came David's deliverance. Deliverance of God's people means judgment against those who oppress them. And soon we will see this on a global scale, as God will deliver the bride from this earth, and the tribulation period will start. So here we go to the deliverance in verse 16. He sent from above, he took me, he drew me out of many waters. He delivered me from my strong enemy, and from them which hated me, for they were too strong for me. They prevented me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my stay. He brought me forth also into a large place. He delivered me, because he delighted in me. Here David describes his actual deliverance. David was being pulled out, he says, out of many waters. It's a very graphic way to describe it. We can imagine something. The many indicates that it was an overwhelming amount of water, like a flood, too much to withstand. And he would have drowned if God had not pulled him out. And as David says, my enemies were too strong for me. And David was brought into a large place, it says. That means a safe place. We see this in other places in the scripture. I've talked about this in the past. A narrow place, a straight place, it's often called. A narrow place means that it's dangerous. But a wide place, a broad place, that is safety. God brought him to safety, where there were no longer any threats. And God did so because, first of all, God had chosen David. He had anointed him. But also because of David's righteousness. We spoke about it in the last time in Psalm 17. That was, we can see that as the righteousness that we receive and can only receive through Jesus. And we will read about this in the following verses in this psalm next time. But that's are the main reasons. God delighted in David because he had chosen and anointed David and because of the righteousness of David. And so we can see here a type. And the type is of the rapture. David was drawn out of many waters. Now, waters often refer to peoples. We can understand this from Revelation 17, verse 15. It's literally explained. It says there, and he said unto me, the waters which thou sawest, where the whore sitteth, are peoples, and multitudes, and nations, and tongues. And in Revelation 13, verse 1, John sees the first beast rising, and he says, and I stood upon the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rise up out of the sea, out of the waters, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. So we understand also from that that the first beast comes from out of the people, whereas the second beast comes out of the earth. There's a difference there. We explain that in depth in our study of the book of Revelation. So, back to the type that he's describing, David was drawn out of many waters. In other words, David describes being pulled out of many people. Just like the church will be removed from among the people of the world, being pulled out. He will do so, God will do so for the same reasons. First, because he chose us first, he loved us first, we read in the New Testament. And because of our righteousness in Jesus. This is the only way he can see us righteous. And he will do so before his anger will be poured out like this smoke out of his nostrils and fire out of his mouth. And as David says here, he sent from above and he took me and he drew me out. And it's you see it almost the same picture as what Paul describes. Jesus will come down from heaven and meet us in the air. He will sort of pull us up and meet us in the air. It's that same picture. Out of many peoples into his large place. It's a wonderful picture. A song of praise here to this wonderful God that we have that will deliver us and in whom we can trust no matter how difficult things are. I will leave it for here. Next time we will look at the second half of this beautiful psalm. Thank you for your attention. Amen.